winter 1945. Deep in the forest of Wisconsin, behind barbed wire and watchtowers, a young Japanese prisoner stood frozen in formation as her commander screamed orders she couldn't hear. Around her, 2,700 prisoners snapped to attention. But Haruka Miyamoto remained still, her eyes fixed forward, unaware of the chaos her silence was about to create. What happened next would challenge everything both sides believed about the enemy, and reveal that sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought with weapons, but with understanding. Camp McCoy stretched across the snow-covered landscape of Sparta, Wisconsin, like a small city carved out of the wilderness. Rows of wooden barracks stood in perfect military precision, separated by muddy pathways that turned to ice in the brutal Midwestern winter. Guard towers loomed at each corner, their searchlights sweeping across the compound every night, casting long shadows that danced across the faces of men who had once been soldiers, but were now simply prisoners, far from home, far from everything they knew. Haruka had arrived at Camp McCoy 3 months earlier, part of a transport of prisoners captured during the fierce fighting in the Pacific. She was 22 years old, thin and exhausted from the journey across the ocean in the cargo hold of a military ship. Unlike the other prisoners, Haruka carried a secret she had managed to hide throughout her entire service in the Japanese military, a secret that had become increasingly difficult to maintain as the structure and discipline of military life demanded instant obedience to shouted commands. She was completely deaf. Born in a small fishing village outside Hiroshima, Haruka had lost her hearing at age 7 from a severe illness that swept through her community. Her family had been poor, and medical care was scarce. By the time anyone realized the extent of her condition, it was too late. But Haruka was intelligent and observant. She learned to read lips with remarkable accuracy, to watch the body language of those around her, to anticipate what was expected by observing others. When the war demanded that every able-bodied person serve, she had hidden her disability, terrified of bringing shame to her family. In the chaos of wartime Japan, she had managed. She watched other soldiers, followed their movements, stayed in the middle of formations where her delayed reactions were less noticeable. She worked in supply units where written orders were common. She survived by being invisible, by being one face among thousands. But here, in the confined space of a prisoner of war camp, with its rigid routines and constant roll calls, her carefully constructed survival strategy was beginning to crumble. Commander Hiroshi Yamamoto was a career military officer, a man who had spent 30 years in the Imperial Japanese Army. Captured on a small island after a devastating battle that left most of his unit dead, he had been stripped of his sword and his dignity, but he clung fiercely to his sense of duty. In the camp, he had appointed himself the unofficial leader of the Japanese prisoners, maintaining discipline, organizing the men, ensuring they conducted themselves with honor, even in captivity. He demanded respect, obedience, and military precision. For weeks, he had noticed Haruka's strange behavior. She was always a half-second behind everyone else during formations. She seemed to ignore direct orders until someone physically touched her or moved in front of her line of sight. During the evening assemblies, when he addressed the prisoners, she never responded to his questions, standing silently while others answered. Yamamoto interpreted this as defiance, as disrespect. In his mind, she was deliberately undermining his authority, showing contempt for the structure he worked so hard to maintain. The breaking point came on a freezing February morning during roll call. The prisoners stood in neat rows in the central yard, their breath visible in the frigid air. Yamamoto walked along the lines conducting inspection, barking orders in Japanese. When he reached Haruka's position, he stopped directly in front of her and issued a sharp command to step forward. Every prisoner within earshot immediately stiffened, recognizing the tone of authority. But Haruka remained motionless, her eyes focused somewhere past his shoulder, her face calm. Yamamoto's voice rose, echoing across the yard. He repeated the command, louder, angrier. Still, Haruka did not move. The other prisoners began to shift uncomfortably. Kenji Sato, who stood beside Haruka, desperately wanted to help, but intervening would only make things worse. He had suspected for some time that something was different about Haruka, had noticed how she always positioned herself where she could see people's faces, how she never responded to sounds behind her, but he had never confronted her about it, respecting whatever privacy she needed to maintain. Yamamoto stepped closer, his face inches from Haruka's, shouting now with full force. The American guards at the perimeter began to take notice, hands moving toward their rifles, uncertain whether this was the beginning of some kind of disturbance. And still, Haruka stood perfectly still, unaware that she was the center of a rapidly escalating situation. It was Sergeant Robert Henderson who first moved to intervene. A veteran of the European theater before being reassigned to guard duty, Henderson had seen enough conflict to recognize when a situation was about to turn violent. He approached quickly, his hand raised in a calming gesture, calling out to Yamamoto in broken Japanese mixed with English. But Yamamoto was beyond listening, his frustration and humiliation at being ignored boiling over into rage. Just as Yamamoto raised his hand, whether to strike or simply to grab Haruka's attention, a sharp voice cut through the tension. Nurse Catherine Morrison had been crossing the yard on her way to the camp infirmary when she noticed the commotion. Kate was 30 years old, a career nurse who had volunteered for military service after Pearl Harbor. She had worked in field hospitals in North Africa and Italy before requesting a transfer stateside to care for her aging mother in Milwaukee. The assignment to Camp McCoy was supposed to be quiet, routine medical care for prisoners and guards alike. But Kate Morrison was not someone who walked past trouble. She strode directly into the center of the confrontation, positioning herself between Yamamoto and Haruka. Her presence was so unexpected, so contrary to the usual protocols that everyone froze. Henderson started to protest, to remind her that prisoners were not her responsibility during formations, but something in her expression stopped him. Kate looked at Haruka carefully, really looked at her for the first time. She noticed how the young woman's eyes never left people's faces when they spoke, how she seemed completely unaware of the shouting that had just occurred behind her, how she was now watching Kate with intense focus, trying to understand what was happening. Kate had worked with deaf patients before, had a cousin who had lost his hearing in a factory accident. She recognized the signs immediately. Moving slowly, deliberately, Kate stepped directly in front of Haruka and raised her hand in a simple gesture, palm forward. Then she pointed to her own eyes, then to Haruka's eyes. Haruka's expression changed instantly, from confusion to shock to something like relief. Her carefully maintained facade cracked, and tears began to stream down her face. In that moment, Kate understood. This young woman had been carrying an impossible burden, hiding a disability in an environment where any weakness could mean death, and she had finally been seen. The confrontation ended as quickly as it had begun, but the questions it raised were just beginning. Kate insisted that Haruka be brought to the infirmary for a medical evaluation. Yamamoto protested loudly, arguing through Private Danny Nakamura, the Japanese-American translator, that this was an internal matter of discipline among the prisoners. Dr. William Foster, the camp's chief medical officer, was called to make a determination. Foster was a practical man, a country doctor from rural Minnesota who had been drafted into service despite being in his 50s. He had no patience for military posturing when it came to medical issues. After a brief examination and a series of simple tests, clapping behind Haruka's head, calling her name when she couldn't see his lips, dropping a metal tray on the floor while she was looking away, he confirmed what Kate had suspected. Haruka was profoundly deaf, had likely been deaf for many years, and had developed extraordinary compensatory skills to hide her condition. The revelation created an immediate dilemma. Camp regulations required that prisoners be able to understand and follow orders for the safety of everyone in the facility. A prisoner who couldn't hear warnings, alarms, or commands was a liability. Some of the senior officers argued that Haruka should be transferred to a different type of facility, perhaps a civilian internment camp where the rules were less rigid. Others suggested she be kept in isolation to prevent problems. But Kate Morrison proposed a different solution. She argued that Haruka had already proven she could function in a military environment by surviving this long, without anyone noticing her disability. What she needed was not isolation or transfer, but accommodation. Kate volunteered to work with Haruka, to teach her a system of visual signals that could replace verbal commands, to help the camp staff understand how to communicate with her. It was an unusual request, one that went far beyond a nurse's normal duties, but Foster was intrigued. Yamamoto, meanwhile, was experiencing his own crisis of understanding. Through Nakamura's translation, he learned the full story of Haruka's deafness, how she had hidden it out of duty and fear of shame, how every day had been a struggle to appear normal. His anger transformed into something more complex, a mixture of respect for her determination and shame at his own failure to recognize her situation. In the rigid hierarchy of military thinking he had lived by all his life, there was no room for individual weakness. But now he was forced to confront the reality that his definition of strength might have been too narrow. Over the following weeks, an extraordinary experiment began at Camp McCoy. Kate spent hours each day with Haruka in a corner of the infirmary, developing a system of communication. They started with basic signs, borrowed from American Sign Language that Kate had learned years earlier, modified and expanded to include specific camp-related concepts: wake up, roll call, mealtime, work detail, medical emergency, lockdown. Haruka proved to be an exceptionally quick learner, her years of compensating for her deafness having sharpened her visual memory and her ability to recognize patterns. But more than that, she was hungry for connection, for the ability to truly communicate rather than simply survive. For the first time since her capture, perhaps for the first time since childhood, someone was meeting her in her world rather than demanding she constantly adapt to theirs. The other prisoners watched this development with mixed reactions. Some saw it as preferential treatment, an unfair advantage. Others recognized it as simple humanity, a necessary accommodation for someone who had already sacrificed more than most. Kenji Sato became an advocate, explaining to the others what he had observed, helping them understand that Haruka had been fighting her own war every single day, invisible and exhausting. Sergeant Henderson, initially skeptical of the entire arrangement, gradually became one of its strongest supporters. He began learning some of the basic signs himself, teaching them to the other guards. He realized that having a clear system of visual communication wasn't just helpful for Haruka, it actually improved communication with all the prisoners, providing a backup method when verbal orders were misunderstood or when language barriers created confusion. Danny Nakamura found himself in a unique position. As a Japanese American, he had spent his entire life navigating between two cultures, never quite belonging fully to either. His family had avoided internment only because his father was a decorated World War I veteran, but the suspicion and prejudice had been constant. Now watching Kate and Haruka build bridges across seemingly impossible divides, he saw a reflection of his own struggle for belonging. He began working with Kate, helping to create signs for Japanese-specific concepts, ensuring that Haruka could maintain connection to her own language and culture, even while learning new ways to communicate. As winter gave way to early spring, the relationship between Kate and Haruka evolved beyond teacher and student, beyond nurse and patient. They became friends, two women from opposite sides of a brutal war, finding common ground in the universal human need for understanding. Kate learned about Haruka's village, her family, the beauty of the coastline where she had grown up. Haruka learned about Kate's life in Milwaukee, her dreams of opening a clinic for underserved communities after the war, her love of music that she tried to describe through vibrations and visual metaphors. There were setbacks and challenges. One night, an alarm sounded indicating a possible escape attempt. Haruka, asleep in her barracks, didn't hear the sirens. By the time someone woke her, the other prisoners were already assembled in the yard and she was marked as non-compliant. Henderson had to intervene, explaining the situation to the officer in charge, arguing that the system needed modification to include visual alarms in the barracks where Haruka slept. The incident led to a broader conversation about accessibility and accommodation. Foster approved the installation of a simple light-based alarm system in Haruka's barracks, a series of bright bulbs that would flash when the auditory alarms sounded. It was a small change, but it represented a significant shift in thinking, an acknowledgement that not everyone experienced the world in the same way, and that differences didn't have to mean inability. Yamamoto's transformation was perhaps the most profound. The rigid military officer who had once viewed Haruka's silence as defiance began to see her as one of the most disciplined soldiers he had ever known. The mental fortitude required to function in a military environment while deaf, to hide such a significant disability out of duty to country and family, to endure the constant stress of potential discovery, spoke to a kind of courage he had never fully appreciated. He began to question other assumptions he had held, other rigid categories he had used to judge people as worthy or unworthy, strong or weak. One afternoon in April, Yamamoto requested a meeting with Haruka. with Nakamura translating and Kate present to facilitate communication. In formal traditional language, he apologized for his treatment of her, for his failure to see beyond his own expectations. Haruka, through signs that Kate voiced, accepted his apology and offered her own, for the deception she had maintained. But more importantly, she thanked him for the opportunity to finally be honest, to stop hiding. As spring fully arrived and the snow melted from the Wisconsin forests, news from the Pacific Theater became increasingly grim for Japan. The prisoners at Camp McCoy listened to rumors and fragmentary information, understanding that the war was entering its final phase. There was talk of invasion, of continued fighting, of enormous casualties on both sides. And then in August, everything changed. The news of Hiroshima reached Camp McCoy like a thunderclap. The prisoners gathered in shocked clusters, trying to comprehend what had happened, the scale of destruction, the new weapon that had been used. For Haruka, the news carried a personal horror that went beyond the strategic or political. Hiroshima was close to her village, close to where her family lived. In the chaos of war and captivity, she hadn't heard from them in over 2 years. Now she might never know what had happened to them. Kate sat with Haruka through those terrible days, holding her hand, offering what comfort she could. There were no words, signed or spoken, that could address such grief. The war ended within days of the second bomb, and the prisoners at Camp McCoy found themselves in a strange limbo, no longer enemy combatants, but not yet free to return home, waiting for the complex logistics of repatriation to be organized. In the months that followed, as the prisoner of war camps across America began the process of closing and sending prisoners home, the question of what would happen to Haruka took on new urgency. Japan was in ruins, occupied by American forces, its infrastructure devastated. What would happen to a deaf woman returning to a country that might not have the resources to support her? Where would she go if her family was gone? Kate made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She filed paperwork to sponsor Haruka's immigration to the United States. It was a complicated process, requiring multiple approvals and extensive documentation. Foster supported the application, writing a detailed medical assessment. Henderson provided a character reference. Even Yamamoto contributed a statement, translated by Nakamura, describing Haruka's courage and determination. The application process took months, extending through the winter of 1946. During that time, Haruka remained at Camp McCoy, which had transitioned from a prisoner of war camp to a processing center for repatriation. Many of the prisoners had already left, returning to a Japan they barely recognized. Yamamoto was among them, departing in November with a formal bow to both Haruka and Kate, acknowledging the lessons he had learned from their unlikely friendship. In February of 1947, nearly 2 years after that winter morning when Kate had first recognized Haruka's deafness, the approval came through. Haruka would be allowed to immigrate to the United States under Kate's sponsorship. The news brought mixed emotions. Relief, certainly, and gratitude, but also grief for everything left behind, for the family she might never see again, for the country that had been her home despite all its flaws and cruelties. Kenji Sato, who had also chosen to remain in America rather than return to Japan, helped Haruka prepare for her new life. He had family in California, in the Japanese-American community that was rebuilding after the internment camps closed. He promised to stay in touch, to help her maintain connection to her language and culture. Nakamura, being discharged from military service, offered similar support, giving her the address of a Japanese-American community center in Milwaukee, where she could find familiar faces and traditions. On a cold but sunny morning in March, Haruka walked out of Camp McCoy for the last time as a free woman. Kate was waiting with her car, ready to drive them both back to Milwaukee, where Haruka would stay with Kate's family while they figured out next steps. As they drove away from the camp, past the guard towers and barbed wire that were already being dismantled, Haruka looked back one final time at the place that had been her prison and, paradoxically, the place where she had finally been able to stop hiding. The years that followed were not easy. Haruka had to learn a new language, navigate a new culture, find her place in a society that was still processing the trauma and prejudices of the war. But she had something she had never had before. People who saw her for who she really was, who communicated with her rather than around her, who valued her not despite her deafness but as a complete person whose deafness was simply one aspect of her identity. Kate eventually opened her clinic in a working-class neighborhood of Milwaukee, and Haruka became one of her first employees, working as a medical assistant. Together, they developed programs to serve deaf and hard-of-hearing patients, creating a model of accessible healthcare that would influence practices far beyond their small clinic. Haruka learned American Sign Language formally, becoming fluent, and began teaching it to others, both deaf and hearing. In 1952, 5 years after leaving Camp McCoy, Haruka received a letter that had been forwarded through multiple channels. It was from her younger brother, who had survived the bombing of Hiroshima and had been searching for her ever since. Their parents had died, but he was alive, rebuilding his life in the devastated city. The correspondence that followed, facilitated by Nakamura's translation services, allowed Haruka to reconnect with the family she thought she had lost forever. She never returned to Japan, but her brother eventually visited Milwaukee, meeting Kate and seeing the life his sister had built. He brought photographs of their village, stories of their parents, pieces of the past that Haruka had thought were gone forever. The reunion was bittersweet, filled with grief for what had been lost and joy for what had survived. The story of what happened at Camp McCoy, of the deaf Japanese prisoner and the American nurse who learned to see her, became part of the local history of Sparta and the surrounding communities. Henderson, who remained in the area after the war, would occasionally tell the story to curious visitors at what was now Fort McCoy, emphasizing the lesson he had learned about looking beyond assumptions and prejudices. Foster, in his later years, wrote a paper for a medical journal about the importance of recognizing and accommodating disabilities in military and institutional settings, using Haruka's case as a central example. The paper was widely read and influenced policy discussions about how the military treated soldiers and prisoners with various disabilities. Yamamoto, back in Japan, became an advocate for disability rights, particularly for deaf individuals. In letters to Nakamura, which were sometimes shared with Haruka, he described how his experience at Camp McCoy had fundamentally changed his understanding of strength and weakness, ability and disability. He worked with schools for deaf children, promoting education and integration rather than isolation. Kate and Haruka remained close friends for the rest of their lives. They appeared together at numerous events promoting cross-cultural understanding and disability rights. They spoke at schools, community centers, and medical conferences, telling their story not as a tale of American benevolence or Japanese gratitude, but as a mutual recognition of shared humanity in the midst of circumstances designed to deny it. In 1978, more than 30 years after the end of World War II, the University of Wisconsin held a symposium on the prisoner of war camps that had operated in the state during the conflict. Kate and Haruka were invited as speakers. Haruka, now in her 50s, stood before an audience of historians, veterans, and students, and through an interpreter, told her story. She spoke about the fear of being discovered, the exhaustion of constant vigilance, the isolation of being unable to truly communicate. But she also spoke about the moment when Kate had seen her, really seen her, and how that moment had changed everything. She described how a war that had been designed to dehumanize and destroy had paradoxically created the circumstances for one of the most important friendships of her life. Kate, sitting beside her on the stage, added her own perspective. She talked about how easy it had been to see prisoners as simply enemies, as problems to be managed rather than people with individual stories and struggles. She described how Haruka had taught her to look deeper, to question assumptions, to recognize that everyone is fighting battles that others cannot see. The audience was silent as they finished, processing the complexity of what they had heard. This was not a simple story of good versus evil, of heroes and villains. It was a story about human beings trying to maintain their humanity in inhumane circumstances, about connection forged across seemingly impossible divides, about the courage required to be vulnerable, and the wisdom required to truly see another person. After the symposium, a young deaf woman approached Haruka, signing her gratitude for sharing her story. She explained that she was studying to become a teacher, that she had faced people telling her that her deafness would prevent her from being effective in the classroom, that she had sometimes doubted herself. Hearing Haruka's story, learning about everything she had overcome, had given her courage to continue. Haruka signed back, with Kate voicing for those nearby who didn't understand sign language. She told the young woman that deafness was not a limitation, but a different way of experiencing the world. that it required others to expand their understanding of communication and connection. She said that the greatest disability was not the inability to hear, but the inability to listen with more than your ears, to see with more than your eyes, to understand that there are many ways of being human, all of them valid, all of them valuable. As the crowd dispersed and the evening drew to a close, Kate and Haruka walked together through the university campus, two elderly women who had once been on opposite sides of a terrible war, now simply friends enjoying a spring evening. They didn't need to speak either with voices or signs. After more than 3 decades, they had developed a communication that went beyond language, an understanding built on shared history and mutual respect. The legacy of their friendship extended far beyond their individual lives. The clinic they had built together continued to serve the community, now run by a new generation of healthcare providers trained in accessible care. The programs Haruka had developed for deaf education became models adopted by schools across the state. The story of Camp McCoy and the unexpected connections formed there became part of the curriculum in local schools, teaching children about the complexity of history and the importance of seeing the humanity in everyone, even those designated as enemies. In the archives of Fort McCoy, researchers would later find documents related to Haruka's case, the medical evaluations, the requests for accommodation, the correspondence about her immigration. These papers, yellowed with age, told an official version of the story. But the real story lived in memory, in the lives changed by an encounter between a deaf Japanese prisoner of war and an American nurse who chose to see beyond the barriers of war, language, and disability to recognize a fellow human being in need of understanding. The forests of Wisconsin that had once surrounded a prisoner of war camp continued to grow, seasons passing, the physical structures of the camp gradually disappearing. But the lessons learned there, the connections forged there, the transformations that occurred there, those remained. They lived on in the people who had experienced them and in the stories passed down to new generations. Haruka Miyamoto, who had once stood frozen in a formation, unable to hear the commands being shouted at her, who had lived in constant fear of discovery and shame, had found something she never expected in the place of her captivity. She had found her voice not through sound but through sign, through connection, through the courage to finally stop hiding. And in doing so, she had helped others find their voices too, had helped break down barriers and challenge assumptions that had seemed immutable. Kate Morrison, who had simply been doing her job when she walked into that confrontation in the yard, had discovered that sometimes the most important medical intervention had nothing to do with medicine. Sometimes healing meant seeing what others missed, creating space for differences, building bridges across divides that seemed unbridgeable. Their story became a testament to the possibility of connection, even in the darkest circumstances, a reminder that wars are fought by governments, but experienced by individuals, that enemies are a political designation, but humanity is a universal reality. It showed that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not fighting but understanding, not conquering but connecting, not hiding, but revealing oneself and being accepted. As the 20th century drew to a close and a new millennium began, the story of the deaf Japanese prisoner of war and the American nurse who learned to see her took on new relevance. In a world still divided by conflicts, still struggling with questions of identity and belonging, still learning to accommodate and celebrate differences, their story offered hope and guidance. It reminded people that change is possible, that understanding can grow even from hostility, that seeing someone truly and completely can transform both the seer and the seen. It demonstrated that disability is often less about individual limitation and more about societal failure to accommodate different ways of being. That communication is about connection rather than conformity, that strength comes in many forms. The barbed wire and guard towers of Camp McCoy were long gone, replaced by modern military facilities and training grounds. But the memory of what had happened there, of the unlikely friendships formed and the lessons learned, remained. It lived in the archives and the history books, but more importantly, it lived in the ongoing work of creating a more inclusive, more understanding, more compassionate world. Haruka and Kate's friendship, born in the unlikeliest of circumstances, nurtured through patience and determination, sustained across decades, stood as proof that human connection could transcend any barrier. Language, culture, disability, war, These were real obstacles, but they were not insurmountable. With willingness to see, to learn, to adapt, to truly listen with more than ears, people could find each other across any divide. If you found this story of unexpected connection and courage inspiring, please subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from history. Leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts on how we can better see and understand those around us, and hit the like button to help others discover this remarkable tale of humanity in the midst of war.